The school aims to look at big issues before the country and to try and at least suggest alternatives to the current political and intellectual orthodoxy. And we've done up a program which I think offers plenty of scope for that, and I hope people have found it generally interesting. And today we've got this very important subject of TTIP. Some people have said the program is very crowded and there's an awful lot in it. But before introducing our chairperson today, I just want to make one or two minor points. I'm passing out the attendance sheet. Many of you will have signed it already, but if you haven't, perhaps you'll be good enough to do so and give us your email for future contact. And if you've already done it, just pass it to your neighbour. There's no point doing it again. And the second point is that after the session, we'll end near 1 o'clock, because if people want to get back for the final session, it begins at 2:30, and I expect there'll be some extra people then. And if people want to get seats for the final session, I think it's important people should get back by 2:30. And in the meantime, we've suggested that people might go around to the Long Stone Bar, which is there in Townsend Street, around the corner in Tarna Street, and they've got reasonably good nosh at lunchtime, which is, people might want a bit of lunch between 1 and 2:30. So I'd just like then to introduce the chairman of this session, Siobhan O'Donoghue, who is very well known in developmental and civic society circles. Siobhan's most recent enterprise has been to launch the Uplift, a new organisation which aims to organise petitions on important issues of the day, and she and her colleagues have launched an important petition on TTIP, which I expect we'll hear a lot more of in the coming period as this becomes more politically to the fore. And Siobhan has a long connection, as I said, with social and community organisations. She has been a member of the migrant director, in fact, of the Migrant Rights Centre, and she also has she was conferred some years ago with the Cathal Ryan Scholarship for Social Entrepreneurship, and she's been involved in issues relating to economic justice, women's equality, anti-racism, and workers' rights. And so we welcome her as chairperson for this session.
Thank you very much. It's great to see such a group here on a Sunday morning. So I'm delighted to be chairing this session. Uplift, as Anthony said, is a very new organisation. We're actually a campaigning community. We do actually a lot more than petitions as well, just to reassure you. And TTIP is one of those core areas of huge concern to our members, but also to, right across the world. I think we're seeing a kind of a realignment of trade, and the institutionalisation of trade relations in a way that doesn't serve democracy, but actually serves the interests of capital in a very destructive way. And we launched our first campaign at the beginning of kind of January this year, and slowly but surely, as people become aware of just how dangerous this toxic deal is, they're becoming more engaged and want to hear more. So I think that's a very kind of a hopeful outlook for that people want to take action and be active on countering this trade deal. Of course, very few people know about TTIP and its dangers, and that's part of our objective, is to really kind of really push out public awareness on TTIP. And actually our next big outing will be the Ploughing Championship, because as we all know, we'll be hearing from our speakers, the farming community is going to be detrimentally impacted by this deal if it goes through. So what better way to engage with farmers in the agriculture sector but to be at the Ploughing Championship. So we'll be, anybody who's interested in being part of our campaign of that, please do sign up, and you'll actually be hearing a lot more about this in the coming week. So my job here is to chair the session. It's a tough job. I was giving out earlier on that I've been given the housekeeping work, because nobody likes being reminded of the time, especially Frank Young. He doesn't follow the rules, I've been told. So anyway, we have three very, very interesting speakers here this morning. Frank Young, who's president of the Technical Engineering and Electrical Union. I never get to say the full thing. Paul Murphy, who's a TD for the Anti-Austerity Alliance for Dublin's West. Jesus, sorry. And Joe Jameson, who is a former research officer with the AFL-CIO in the US, and I'll say a little bit more as I introduce them. So the first person up is Paul Murphy, and Paul's going to speak for 20 minutes, and then we're going to hear the speakers, and then allow a good chunk of time at the end for comments and questions and discussion. So please do keep your notes going as we go through the speakers, because I'm sure there's more information. It'll spark an awful lot of questions and thoughts, so keep a note of those. So I'm going to welcome Paul. And just to say, Paul served for 3 years on the Trade Committee in the European Parliament, so he probably knows a huge amount about the kind of the background to TTIP and the way in which it was kind of established, the process, the negotiation process was established. So I'm looking forward to hearing some of this stuff.
Thanks a lot, Siobhan, and thanks a lot for the invite to come and speak. So previously I was the Irish MEP on the Trade Committee. Now you have the benefit of having Sean Kelly on the Trade Committee, so things haven't got any better in terms of Irish MEPs' attitudes to trade. So we've divided up some of the different aspects of TTIP to talk about today, and in particular I'm going to focus on ISDS, the Investor State Dispute Settlement Mechanism, that I think the kind of people who come to meetings like this are probably aware of. The question of the lobby, the role of lobbying, how the ruling class transmits its interests to the political establishment, the process by which TTIP has to go through in order to become ultimately, the biggest free trade deal in the world, and our resistance and some points about it. But the kind of framework is TTIP as class war, because I think that there is now a lot more awareness in Ireland about TTIP than there has been previously, and the last 9 months has seen an awareness about what's happening. But I think often, which is often the case with treaties and stuff in particular, the thing can be quite mystified even for those who know about it. It's this like weird conspiracy of global elites in secret rooms discussing things secretly, which is all true, but it's a way of understanding it that sometimes can actually disempower people, as opposed to understanding that TTIP is not a conspiratorial exception, but it's the rule. And that it's of a piece with the internal, policies of the European Union. There's a complete parallel that the foreign policy of the European Union, the trade policy of the European Union is an extension of the internal policy. And you see it, like it's absolutely parallels the developments that are happening inside the European Union, which broadly speaking, we have characterized as amounting to authoritarian neoliberalism, as a new model of a further entrenched neoliberalism with austerity as law rather than policy, with a complete absence of democratic rights, and with an imperialistic character both internally and externally, with Greece being the classic example of how you see that taking place. And then externally, the same policies exactly taking place, and the same attack of democratic rights existing as a trend now in policies. Obviously, I have no illusions in bourgeois democracy, but even limited bourgeois democratic, parliamentary democratic rights are being severely restricted in the context of trying to get austerity imposed as effectively as possible. And it's not for nothing. My point is that it's functional. It's functional because there's massive opposition to austerity. If these policies are subject to even normal democratic procedure in parliaments, parliamentarians can come under pressure not to do them, and so it's in their interest to undermine democracy or democratic rights within the European Union, but also with mechanisms like TTIP to bypass normal democratic procedures. The other point I want to make is that, again, TTIP isn't new. I mean, it's great that there's loads of people now who know about this thing called TTIP and know that trade is used as a weapon by the 1% across the world, but in the developed capitalist countries in particular. But I think it is also important to place that in a context, which is trade is a weapon and has been a weapon for decades, and is developing a more and more pronounced weapon, more favoured weapon by the establishments, particularly in Europe over the past few decades. And we should note that the primary use of trade agreements has been to increase the rate and level of exploitation of countries in the neo-colonial world. It's about stopping the prospect of any real development, keeping them as a source for immense raw materials, human labour, massive exploitation, and driving a neoliberal agenda. That's the nature of the trade deals that are done, mentioned above, but also undermining democratic rights. think this quote from John Hillary, who is really an excellent pamphlet on TTIP, I think it's, in my opinion, it's the best, most popularly accessible pamphlet that's been written on TTIP. This quote sums up a key essence of what TTIP is about. But obviously, the negotiations are taking place between the EU and the US. And it is true, and in a sense this quote understates it. There are contradictions and disagreements between the European capitalist classes, let's say, and the American capitalist class, and there are conflicts taking place in relation to agriculture, in relation to finance. There are differences between them, that's a real thing. But the dominant thing that's taking place in these talks is that you have representatives of big business from both sides of the Atlantic coming together to discuss how effectively to drive a race to the bottom across both sides of the Atlantic in terms of labour rights, environmental rights, consumer protection, and increasing the right to profit. It's an agenda driven by transatlantic corporations, and the primary people who are affected here are not represented at the negotiating table. That on both sides of the negotiating table are people who represent the interests of big business and are driving this agenda. Something to note, I think people probably know about this, but it's called a free trade agreement. Well, it's called Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership, but it's posed as a free trade agreement when in reality there is free trade between the EU and the US. The tariff barriers between the EU and the US are minimal in reality, and so 80% of the benefits come from so-called non-tariff barriers. And non-tariff barriers, that's the key thing to watch here, because a minimum wage legislation is a non-tariff barrier. The right to people not to eat pork fed by ractopamine or injected with ractopamine hormones is that, not to eat chicken that's washed in chlorine, not to have fracking. They're all non-tariff barriers. And that's the target here from the point of view of the establishment. It's where they reckon that increased profits will come about. The other thing to note is that it's correct to oppose this in its own terms, in terms of the impact it will have on workers, on farmers, on consumers on both sides of the Atlantic. But it's also correct to see the more global agenda here, because this isn't just about the EU and the US and the benefit for big business on both sides here. It's about setting what they call a gold standard for the world. This will be the world's biggest free trade agreement if they conclude it. You combine that with the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which will be the second biggest free trade agreement, which will have core elements that are essentially the same. And that then is the rule for all trade agreements into the future. That in effect, the big, dominant capitalist nations have managed to write the rules for trade, and any other country that wants to do a trade deal has to sign up for them, otherwise they won't be able to do a deal. So they'll become kind of the bottom line standards of all trade deals into the future. They've managed to supplant or replace the World Trade Organization, which is not an organization we would support, but they managed to effectively push it aside and then just dominate entirely by the dominant capitalist nations, setting a high bar of liberalisation, enshrining corporate rights with ISDS and with regulatory harmonisation. So to move on to the kind of core of one of the things I'm talking about, I would say people here probably do know about ISDS. So investor-state dispute settlement mechanism. It's a situation, it's a parallel process of justice, whereby corporations have the right through investment treaties and through free trade agreements to take countries to court effectively, what are administrative tribunals, and sue them effectively for expropriation, direct, indirect expropriation. I'll make a point on that in a minute. Including they then have a right to compensation. These courts are private, so-called administrative tribunals. The people who sit on them are lawyers. The private lawyers are not judges elected by any country or whatever. They're paid up to €3,000 a day, and they're chosen by the company. So there's an inbuilt incentive for these administrative tribunals, the lawyers linked to them, to find in favour of corporations, because it means they'll get more business into the future. If you're a corporation, you're looking to sue a state, you're going to choose a lawyer as the head of the administrative tribunal who was previously found in favour of other corporations. I think, and this is really developing and has been developing over the past decade and a half as a key weapon of big business to undermine the right of countries to regulate, which can interfere with the right to profit. And I think that the parallel with the fiscal treaty, the six-pack, the two-pack within the EU is quite striking, where it's the notion that policies that were previously subject to political democratic debate between different sides, etc., that's excluded now from that democratic space and that political discussion. And now these things become a matter of law. So the use of law effectively, or like quasi-law in the case of these administrative tribunals, as a means to undermine, to take things out of a democratic space, take things out of a place of discussion, undermining the right of governments to regulate and enshrining the right of corporations to profit, or in the case of internally in the EU, to enshrine as law the need for austerity to be implemented. There's a point about the rise since the 1990 to now in terms of the number of disputes of ISDS. The core companies that take people to administrative tribunals in ISDS are from the US and from the EU. 24% are from the US, 40% are from the EU, so together that's 64% of the total of these sort of cases. And the way it works, in terms of like the essence of getting to it, of what's at heart here, is it's contained in the definition of expropriation. I'm for expropriation. I say there's lots of people in the room who are for expropriation, for taking the wealth out of the hands of big business, out of the hands of the wealthy, and using it in the interest of the majority. But we're all expropriators now. If anybody wants to increase the minimum wage, that's expropriation. If anybody wants to ban fracking, that's expropriation. If anybody wants to have certain standards in terms of food, in terms of environment, in terms of anything, that all now counts as expropriation. By the definition of expropriation, through measures tantamount to expropriation, indirect expropriation, regulatory expropriation, and anything that interferes with the right of a corporation to profit as they expected can now be called expropriation, and companies can sue under the ISDS for that interference with that right to make a profit. And this quote by William Grider, I think really, it sums up the fact that it's not an accidental thing that big business has stumbled upon, but it's like a long-term strategy. And because any new regulation is bound to have some economic impact on private assets, this doctrine is a formula to shrink the reach of modern government and cripple the regulatory state, undermining long-established protections for social welfare and economic justice, environmental values, and individual rights. Some examples of what this means in reality. Again, some people maybe have heard of some of these cases. So Philip Morris has sued both Uruguay and Australia in ISDS courts for legislation, anti-smoking legislation relating to plain packaging, relating to the kind of warnings that have to be placed on boxes. The European Commission is at really pains to insist that their slightly modified version of ISDS, which is just like kind of a facade put on top of it, wouldn't allow something like that to happen, but that's not definitively the case. Philip Morris could potentially sue European governments, including the Irish government, for interference with their right to profit, with their trademark, if plain packaging legislation is implemented as it is meant to be in Ireland. Vattenfall against Germany, which is a Swedish energy company, sought compensation of 3.7 billion euros because of the phase out of nuclear power. So they had an expectation to continue to produce nuclear power, to continue to profit. The German government agreed to phase nuclear power out, and then they've sued the German government with 3.7 billion euros. Lone Pine, a US corporation, but in reality a Canadian corporation with a US subsidiary, suing Canada, its own government, in an administrative tribunal, seeking $250 million because of a moratorium implemented on fracking. Canada against ABB Bowater, which was a pulp company which had a license to use certain resources in a certain area, subject to it continuing to produce. It stopped producing, it sold its license to someone else against its conditions. The government took the license away from it, said it wasn't allowed to do it. It sued successfully, got a settlement of $130 million, and was effectively allowed to transfer this right to use the natural resources, even though it was against the original agreement. Veolia is currently suing Egypt for raising the minimum wage, and Ethel Corporation got $13 million because of a ban that Canada imposed on a petroleum additive, MMT, which was a proven health hazard. It's not just, the point is, like, it's the cases themselves are bad, right? That's obvious. But it's the chilling effect of knowing that if you make any regulations that interfere with the right of these corporations to profit, you're going to be dragged into these immense court cases where you're paying $1,000 a day for your lawyers, your multiple lawyers as your state, to defend you, and ultimately you could lose and have to give a massive settlement. And that has a massive chilling effect on governments' ability to regulate, to make laws on any of these matters into the future. And it's a telling quote from a former Canadian government official, whereby they got letters from New York and DC law firms coming up to the Canadian government on virtually every new environmental regulation, and none of them then saw the light of day. The other thing is how effectively corporations are transatlantic. Well, the core corporations that carry, that hold, that control a whole bunch of the wealth in the world are transatlantic. They've fundamentally linked to one country in most cases, but have subsidiaries, etc. elsewhere. And they have a right to just, it's not just that US corporations will sue European governments, but in effect, European corporations will use their American subsidiaries to sue European governments. And here's a quote which comes from the Corporate Europe Observatory, which explains how that would happen, where this guy, big business guy, is asked, could you sue both the EU and the US under TTIP if you felt that some profits were foregone without justification? Yes, all of the above, depending on what works at the time. They're a Swiss company, but listed on the US stock market and very much active in Europe, so they can take either the US government or European governments to court as they wish. Okay, so moving on to lobbying. I mean, it's something that I've found interesting since being in the European Parliament, since being in the Dáil, is working out how the economic interests of the 1% are translated into political policies of the political parties. Because obviously, it's not always as simple as Dennis O'Brien ringing up Enda Kenny or whatever. So how exactly does the economic 1% transmit its interests and its desires to the political establishment? And obviously a key method seen above all in the European Parliament and the European institutions is the method of lobbying. So this gives you a sense. The European Commission makes a point of talking about being very open to meet different groups, public interest groups, consumer groups, trade unions, corporations, to talk about TTIP. And this is the balance which is taken from Corporate Europe Observatory of who they met over the last while, which obviously is overwhelmingly oriented towards the corporate lobby groups. In the European Parliament, they are meant to be transparent. They're meant to register the fact that they are engaged in this sort of lobbying. They don't, they haven't been. Again, Corporate Europe Observatory has done quite detailed work explaining how they're getting away with not registering the fact that they're lobbying. So 1 in 5 companies that are engaged in lobbying on TTIP aren't being open about it at the moment. And the other important point to note is that they're the same people. The people doing the lobbying and the people being lobbied are the same people at different times. So, you know what I mean? It's this relationship that exists whereby they know each other, they meet each other for drink, they don't have to register each other, etc. So I mean, my main foe when I was in the European Parliament was Karel de Gucht, who was the trade commissioner at the time, an extreme neoliberal free trade advocate who openly said, my job is to open new markets for European businesses. That was his perceived self-mandate. So since being trade commissioner, he's since gone to work for the board of Belgacom, which is a major telecommunications company, which is a major interest in TTIP. And the commission sanctioned the fact that he was able to go and work with them inside what would normally be a period of gardening leave, on the condition that he doesn't get directly involved in lobbying on TTIP. But there you go. The guy who was writing the trade deal from the point of view of the European side is now on the board of a company that is, has a personal or a corporate interest in the implementation of it. John Clancy, who was the spokesperson to Karel de Gucht, now works for FTI Consulting, which is another lobbying company. Maria Toralero, who was a key person in DG Trade, the trade civil servants at the European level, now works for the European Federation of Pharmaceutical Industries and Associations. Tobias McKenney, who was a key person in DG Internal Market, now works for Google. The list goes on and on and on, and it's both ways as well, because we have our own Irish person, Owen O'Malley, who was who was previously a leading person in Business Europe, which is the leading kind of big business IBEC type organisation on a European-wide level, and now is a leading person within DG Sanko and DG Trade, who are responsible for the trade negotiations. So in order to have a chance of getting this through, the whole thing has to be undemocratic, extremely undemocratic. The thing itself is undemocratic, if they ever got it agreed, but the whole process is extraordinarily undemocratic. So negotiations are carried out absolutely in secrecy, and the Commission thinks it's absolutely ludicrous that you would call for open negotiations for people to be able to see, to participate, etc. That it has to be that there's commercial sensitivity, that there's own interests at stake. You couldn't possibly, allow this to be public. It's a joke because we know that the US side, we know the amount of spying, etc. that's taking place. There's no doubt that the US side have access to all the internal documents of the European side, but it's European citizens that don't have access to the documents from the European side. So according to the Lisbon Treaty, European Parliament shall be immediately and fully informed at all stages of the procedure, and that means 7 MEPs, one from each political group, going into a room and reading documents, not having a right to photocopy them, and not having a right to bring them out, anything like that. And of course we know that big business is at the core of the talks. I mean, big business, say Business Europe, wrote a big long paper on regulatory cooperation, which Frank might talk about, and the Commission went through it line by line, responding to every one of their issues, saying, well, that's a good idea, that's a bad idea, that they're in the talks, in effect, from the very beginning, and the Commission thinks that's absolutely okay. The Commission claims the TTIP talks are the most open ever. They're not. There's a secret reading room in Brussels whereby even government people from the different European states have to go in to this secret reading room, not allowed to copy anything, etc., etc. The European Parliament and ISDS in particular, you might have seen or got the impression that the European Parliament was taking a hard line against ISDS. That was an impression created by the core Social Democrats. That's not the reality. Unfortunately, the European Parliament voted a significant majority for a resolution that's broadly speaking pro-TTIP and is pro-ISDS with a facade to pretend that it's not as bad as it is, but it's just a cover. I mean, Bernd Lange, who's the leading Social Democrat on trade from Germany, he claimed that old ISDS has now been thrown in the dustbin of history. It's rubbish, because the Commission is also moving to present a more sanitised version of ISDS that in essence is exactly the same, and the Parliament at the moment is just providing cover for that. Our representatives, Sean Kelly there, TTIP offers massive opportunities for the Irish economy. He just echoes all the propaganda from the Commission non-stop about how deadly this will be for everybody possible, massive growth figures that are not based on reality or anything linked to reality. Obviously the people who are against it, I should mention, the people in GUI NGL, so Sinn Féin and Ming Flanagan have been opposing it, and Nessa Childers, who's in the Social Democrats, has also been opposing it. Just to conclude, I really think we can win this one. I think it is one that's winnable because of, on the one hand, they're so slow on this. The negotiations were meant to be finished already. They were meant to be finished at the end of 2014, and they didn't even get going ISDS negotiations until then. And so 150,000 submissions, 97% of them were opposed to ISDS, with the result that the Trade Commissioner said, had to emphasise that it's a consultation, not a referendum. There are major institutional hurdles for them. We shouldn't just think that it's an easy road for them to get this agreed. There are real difficulties that they have amongst themselves. They're at the 11th round of negotiations, and there are differences between the two sides that we can use to our own advantage. If it was passed, if they agreed a deal between the Trade Commissioner and effectively the US government, then what they need is to get a qualified majority vote at the Council, they need to get a majority in the European Parliament, and they may have to get a majority in all national parliaments, depending on whether it's seen as a mixed agreement or a purely trade agreement. In reality, it is a mixed agreement, it should be seen as a mixed agreement, but they may try to avoid that democratic check by avoiding that. The political hurdles are us. The lessons of the ACTA victory, people might remember that, which was a deal that was being done, an international deal that would have restricted internet freedom amongst other things, is that the Dracula strategy can be successful. That you have to bring these things out into the open where people can see it, expose it to as many people as possible, and then it can wither and die under the glare of that public opinion. To exploit the contradictions between the EU and the US, And that is a real thing. Things like agriculture, things like finance, things like services. There are differences. They're not the primary contradiction that exists here, but they're differences that we can use and mobilise around and create difficulties for them in the talks. Anti-TTIP groups exist in loads of places. Trade unions and US action are key. One small point, we shouldn't forget about CETA, which isn't a done deal, which contains ISDS, worse ISDS than they're talking about. That's the deal with Canada. And I think we should have specific actions on TTIP, but also integrated into the anti-austerity struggles, integrated, as is happening to some extent, in the anti-water charges struggles. And then finally, the next International Week of Action, which is so vital. It has to be an international thing. It can't be just European. It can't be just US. International Day of Action, International Week of Action is from the 10th and 17th of October, which is about TTIP, but it's also about CETA and a whole series of these type of free trade deals.
That was really an amazing race through in some of a very complex topic, and especially kind of that part about ISDS. And I think it's worth noting that Ireland is the only country in the European Union that doesn't actually have an active ISDS. And considering that, you know, significantly more foreign direct investment, US foreign direct investment in the EU comes through Ireland, it makes us a very critical player in terms of, even though we're comparison to our size, we actually are quite a critical player in this, in fighting this this really toxic agreement. So we're going to talk a little bit more afterwards, and hopefully in the discussion, about the whole ratification process and some of the more. I'm sure there's lots of questions already. So we're just going to move on very quickly to Frank Keown. And Frank, I'm not actually sure what he's going to talk about, but I think it's TTIP, CETA, and TISA. So, you know, a corporate power grab. So, you know, put on your seatbelts.
It is working. I thought about how I might present this corporate power grab in a single picture, and this is what I came up with. The map of North America and Europe will change significantly if TTIP or TISA or CETA are passed. You can see that these are the badges of the corporations, and they're the people who will rule us from then on. The governments will lose so much power, and they have engineered in such a way that it's right down to local level, municipality level. They will challenge right down to municipality level in procurement and in actual, I suppose, legislative measures also. So this is a very serious situation, and everybody should be engaged with it, in my opinion. Sorry, one thing. I made a bit of a mess of that now, didn't I?
Grand.
Because I wasn't sure whether it was working or not. We're back. Paul has rightly emphasised ISDS, and I think for most people it is simple to engage with the ISDS issue, and if you're against TTIP or CETA for that reason, that's quite good enough for me. Certainly the idea of corporate sovereignty is, to me, feudal in its conception. It's going way back to when somebody sitting in a big castle, in this particular instance sitting in a boardroom somewhere, sorry Joe, New York, I just picked, decides how we will live our lives, the conditions in which we will live our lives, and how they will actually rule us. So it's an extraordinary agreement. But thanks to WikiLeaks, and thanks to some people with some principle who leaked some of the information from the talks, we now know that there is something on top of ISDS that will operate every day in which these agreements will be in existence, if they come into existence. And that is regulatory cooperation or regulatory convergence. The name has changed quite a few times, and that will allow decisions to be made without any democratic oversight or no democratic input. They will be made in secret, like most of the decisions that are made associated with these so-called trade agreements. Of course, I don't believe they're trade agreements, and after you examine them, you will agree, I'm sure. So, in this process, this regulatory convergence process, business will be engaged right from the beginning of the process. They're setting up structures which will allow business to be involved right from the very beginning. I believe personally that it will make ISDS redundant after a number of years, simply because no government, the regulatory chill that Paul mentioned, no government would dare bring in something that the corporations oppose, because they would find themselves in an ISDS court. That court, of course, is run by the World Bank. It's secret. despite what Mrs. Malmstrom might say. The hearings are held in secret. And, of course, who wins? Well, the incentive is that big business wins all the time. And, of course, just remember, governments cannot sue big business at an ISDS court. And all the obligations are on governments. There are no obligations on the companies. I think that tells you practically everything about it. So, regulatory convergence comes in 3 packages. And they are, if you think about, they'll first of all look for mutual recognition. And when they are then making progress at that, they'll bring in harmonisation. And then in the end, you will have regulatory cooperation, which will crown it all. And that will be the secret area where they will decide how we live and even die eventually. Now, everything, practically everything, I'll show you an extract from the CETA agreement later on, which is actually public. Practically everything is open to regulatory convergence. Practically everything. So first of all, mutual recognition. It sounds harmless enough. The 2 trading blocks are implemented between them, and we would recognise US standards, and I picked the example of safety standards. So a US product that meets US safety standards from the Food and Drug Administration, I assume, would be allowed into Europe and vice versa. So the consumer, in the case of food, would have the choice between American standard food or EU standard food. So if one side, and this is what Siobhan said earlier about farmers being in trouble, if one side can produce food to a lesser standard and put it into supermarkets here in Ireland, I'm just taking the Irish situation, what do you think is going to happen? What are most people going to buy? You know, the pressures are such on people that they probably will go for the one at the lower standard. And then, of course, what happens next? You can imagine what it is. Harmonisation. Lower standards are in the supermarkets, example of food, but it also applies to chemicals and applies to many other things. And after these, I've taken pesticides in this instance, after these standards are accepted by the EU for these products, then the objectives of the corporations will be to drive down the standards within the EU to the same standard, presuming the American standards are lower, and we know they are for chemicals, for example. Chemicals in food in particular. So down to the same standard. And the pesticide lobby document, which was released a couple of months ago, it calls for significant harmonisation between the EU and US rules for establishing limits for how much of a pesticide can remain in food and feed products. So it's not just, you think of agricultural things growing in the fields, getting sprayed and so on. The feed products that are fed to the animals, exact same thing. And Paul mentioned hormones, etc. And then we go on to regulatory cooperation. And this is where I think this will make ISDS redundant. The chapter on regulatory cooperation, future measures that could lead towards, for example, more sustainable food system or beneficial health measures. Cigarettes being, of course, one of them. Those regulations we deem barriers to trade, and implementation could be refused before they see the light of day. And in fact, it will be, because these will be closed negotiations that will be ongoing every single day, probably. Whereas ISDS issues occur maybe, I think the largest number was 67 in 1 year so far. This will be ongoing and in secret. And we'll keep going until they exhaust any of the differences. And that's the plan. I found this the other day from Plaid Cymru, the Welsh party. It says, and encapsulates it very well, TTIP will lower standards on the environment, food safety, personal data, financial services and much more by giving business the power to derail or freeze government decisions. I don't think Plaid Cymru is a very radical left party or anything like that. And I think that's really succinct. It's really succinct. So how are they going to do all this? So they have this thing called the Regulatory Cooperation Council. They changed the name of that a few times as well. It's like Long Cash changing the name, and it can be different. It would include a streamlined procedure to amend the sectoral annexes of TTIP or add new ones. So the corporations come in and look for new regulations. They can propose their own regulations as well within the Regulatory Cooperation Council. No domestic ratification procedures, of course, why would they? And no democratic control. And that's pretty horrifying if you think about it. And this will meet regularly, and it'll work with the regulators. And this, by the way, the US and the European Commission will sit on this and work with the regulators are the US and the EU Commission in crafting regulatory measures or in taking decisions on how to further compatibility of existing ones. So really it's just the corporations on an equal footing with the sovereign government of the United States and the sovereign governments who are members of the EU. But of course, the sovereign governments within the EU won't have much say in this. The Lisbon Treaty gave the EU the right to negotiate all these trade agreements. So we've handed that away as well. So it's really an incredibly serious situation. Now it's a bigger threat is ISDS, I think. It is a ratcheting mechanism. It'll go click, 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 like most things in the EU, which you vote for the Lisbon Treaty and nothing happens. So everybody says, oh, sure, that wasn't too bad. Then 5 years later, we find the EU negotiating this stuff for us on our behalf. And there's no way out of it. We have treaty obligations. Well, the only way out of it is to leave the EU, of course. That's the obvious thing, I suppose. And back in 2012, and this is extraordinary, because the EU and the US have actually acquiesced in this. Business Europe, which takes together all the big business organisations in Europe, including IBEC, presented with the US Chamber of Commerce, which is very active in Ireland, by the way, they're not just sitting around being nice, presented the Commission with a series of proposals. But this is the quote that I want to bring to your attention: to put stakeholders at the table with regulators to essentially co-write regulation. And if TTIP comes in, they will have achieved that, as TTIP stands at the moment. And there's not going to be much room to change this. This is Mr. What's his name again? Kenny, with the President of the United States. And that was on St. Patrick's Day, when he sat down, he was tea-tipping his cap, as I said to Mr. Obama. We're very supportive of this. He doesn't seem to know really quite what it is. I don't think he cares because the corporations like it and Mr. Kenny likes it. I want to say a little bit, I think that's scary enough in itself. I just want to say something about the precautionary principle, because the coalitions that have grown up in opposition to TTIP and CETA and TISA are very wide, broad coalitions, broad front, if you like, of the 70s, reincarnated. They're environmentalists, trade unionists, and all those people who are concerned about how our society is to develop. And the precautionary principle is a very important one from the point of view particularly of environmental and food issues. And the EU operates the precautionary principle. I'll explain in a second. It sets standards on food safety in particular. And a product may be withdrawn from a market in the EU if there is a risk that it may pose a danger to human health. If there is a risk that it may pose a danger to human health, even if there's insufficient scientific data on which to base a full evaluation. Now that's very important. It's then up to the corporation or the manufacturer to prove that it's safe. The opposite situation pertains in the US. And I put this little, I can't remember where I got this, but it's the frogs. And the fella inside in the pot is saying, prove we'll be boiled alive. And that's the American approach to food safety. And the other fella is putting his toe in and he's saying, prove we won't be. And that really encapsulates it. So this is a very important issue, the precautionary principle. The US government, as I said, doesn't do it, but here we come back to regulatory convergence again and pushing against the precautionary principle that applies throughout EU member states. And of course it's a grinding process. We're not going to achieve all this in 1 year or 2 years, but let's look 10 years down the road. They will have achieved a significant portion of it. 10 years down the road, there's absolutely no doubt about it, because as Paul pointed out, the Commission is very pro-business. The Commission is pushing this. Our own government has done a lot internally to push it. I haven't heard one little bit of criticism from anybody in the government, that includes TDs. There are some famous examples. The American people wash their chicken and turkey carcasses in chlorine. This is because, of course, it's the end product that's examined in America, whereas the EU operates a farm-to-fork principle. And 90% of US beef is produced using growth hormones. It's been banned in the EU states since 1998. And I just put a picture of Frau Merkel with a Hühnchen, chicken, actually it's a cock, but anyway, it doesn't matter, Because she said over her dead body, would European chickens be washed in chlorine? And no doubt you're going to hear that if a big debate develops. However, it's at the implementation phase that the EU can lower standards without any discussion. So that's another dangerous aspect of it. You won't be told about it. I just want to mention the privatisation agenda, because really, when Paul talked about the very small tariff barriers between the EU and the US, what's left? Well, public services. Public services. That's what's left. And the US agenda is definitely a privatisation agenda. Well, I have to say that the EU Commission's agenda is also a privatisation agenda. But in negotiations, there is something called a negative list and a positive list. You can have two approaches to negotiations. And if TTIP adopts the negative list, and I'll tell you in a sec what it is, then all public services are surrendered to liberalisation, which means privatisation or potential privatisation, unless they're marked out as exceptions. So that's the negative list. It's the list and lose it model. Up to now, the EU has operated a positive list. In other words, the things you don't want to be liberalised, you list them all within the trade agreement. But the pressure is on. I've looked at the CETA document, the CETA agreement, and I'll just show you a little extract of that in a minute. The Irish government exceptions are pathetic. And let me be very clear about this. There are no exceptions on water, there are no exceptions on health, and there are no exceptions on education. So, you can work that out for yourself. There are no exceptions. That's the Canadian EU agreement. Mr. Chomsky had something to say about this. Modern capitalism, costs and risks are socialised to the greatest extent possible while profit is privatised, and we have seen that in the case of Greece and Ireland and others, so no need for me to convince you. This is the Business Alliance for TTIP slogan down at the bottom, or on our logo. But if there was a shift away from the positive list, as I've said, it would bring about large-scale privatisation. And, of course, EU business groups, including our friends in IBEC, have called for the negative list. Because, of course, they see big killings in private healthcare and in private education. And the US experience in private education has been pretty awful. In fact, the education bodies have sued the US government twice in the last number of years for trying to bring in regulation. I suppose you can't see that, but it will verify the truth of what I'm saying. This is reservations applicable to Ireland for the Canadian EU agreement, which also has ISDS, as pointed out by Paul. These reservations are, right, the establishment of something to prohibit the cross-border provision of the supply of executive search services. I don't know what that is. It's something got to do with financial services, I think. Then financial services, they talk about protecting suppliers within the financial services. Up here, on this side, Ireland reserves the right to adopt and maintain any measure with respect to the provision of privately funded social services other than services relating to convalescent and rest houses and old people's homes. And down here then, we have road transport, passenger transportation. It's the tests for intercity and rural bus services. That's it. That's all we have reservations on. The rest is open. And remember, if a US firm has a subsidiary in Canada, they can sue from Canada, even if TTIP doesn't go through. And this is the danger with CETA. If they have a subsidiary in Canada, they can sue from Canada. It's absolutely unbelievable. Kerry Foods strikes me as an example of a company that could sue Ireland from their subsidiaries in the US, for example. It's appalling, absolutely appalling. So stop privatisation, it's eating up everything. Little fella there with the microphone. It's a smash and grab, there's no doubt about it. And I talked about subsidiaries, and I think I'll just say there's no provision for investors' obligations, only the rights. I'd be remiss if I didn't say something about labour standards. I think they're trying to, there is a big plan, I might call it that, conspiracy I might call it even, to push down labour standards, because of course they're barriers to trade. And it's not just the US, the EU as well, of course, various directives and enactments and court judgments over the last number of years have tended, by and large, to push down labour standards. But the US government has refused to ratify the 7 core ILO conventions, with the exception of 2, so 5 they haven't ratified, which, of course, would bring on pressure not just to the EU countries, by and large, by the way, have ratified them. There are some gaps, but generally the EU conforms to ILO standards, but there would be pressure to minimise conformance. And of course the ECJ is so compliant that you never know what they're going to do, but they'll certainly act on the side of the Commission or the corporations. And then we have another phenomenon in the United States, which Joe probably will talk about, and which has accelerated over the last decade, is what's called right-to-work states. And those put great pressures on trade unions. For instance, trade union subs, representation criteria, etc. And basically they handcuff, if I might say that, organisation by trade unions. So it's an opportunity really to relocate business to where, I suppose, it's cheaper, and workers' rights and workers' incomes will be lower. I have to say something about the Irish government's position, because Minister Bruton made a big thing about it will add 5% to EU GDP and create 400,000 extra jobs. Didn't say how many would be in Ireland, by the way. But there was a study later, which I'll just have a few words about. This was based on a study by an Austrian outfit called the IFO, and even the Commission said this is ridiculous, it's unrealistically high. And that is what would happen if the EU economy and the US economy were fully integrated with each other. Now, the Centre for Economic Policy and Research did a study for the Commission, and they said at least 1.3 million workers in the EU would be displaced. We're a peripheral country, and of course the periphery suffer usually more than the core. So you can take it that labour displacement in this country would be quite serious. We are an open economy as well, of course. And they also said, of course, that wages will go up in line with GDP. But this is a very interesting little graph. It runs from about 1970 to 2012, and it's the labour income share of GDP in a few major EU countries. Ireland is not in it. People ignore Ireland generally when doing this kind of work. And the labour share of GDP dropped very sharply, as you can see there, over that period, from 67% to 57%, so 10% went out of people's pockets. It certainly didn't go into public spending, which has been reduced all over Europe. Of course, 10% plus went into the pockets of the big corporations, and maybe small corporations as well. So their conclusions, in my view, have taught great doubts on the deal. Great doubt altogether. Because it starts from the assumption of full employment, that as jobs are lost, jobs are created. It's hard to believe that this can be treated seriously. Jobs are never created or lost. This is just incredible stuff. And they move from less competitive sectors to more competitive sectors overnight, magically, right? 5 minutes. I'll skip a few. Magically. And of course, there are costs to an economy when workers lose their jobs, and this is also ignored. And they ignore regional variation. So gains to the EU, and that doesn't say where in the EU these gains will be, 0.5% in GDP growth over 10 years. And it took me a while, and took other campaigners a while to figure this out as well. It's 0.5% over 10 years. That's not 0.5% per year. That's the total over the 10 years. And the way to figure that one out is that they said that everybody would get €545 more income, right, in disposable income. 260 a week, and here's 4 happy people with their 260 after getting a Costa coffee, which is another corporation. And they're delighted with themselves. It's a hell of a lot to give up for a cup of coffee, I can tell you that, per week. Down with regulation, that's what it's about. Down with regulation, up with profits. And these 3 bios here made it clear that these 2 are gone now, but been replaced by equally horrible people. And they made it very clear that that's the end objective. Out with regulation, away with it. I just want to say a few words about TISA in the 2.5 minutes that are left for me. TISA is way off the agenda altogether. Nobody is paying much attention to it, but it's another secret agreement, trade and services agreement, because of course the other one is not really looking too much at services, but this one is trying to liberalise trade in services and investment. And it says it's going to expand regulatory disciplines on all service sectors, including many public services, excuse me. So, I'll read it because it's really quite scary. The treaty rules, if they're implemented, will provide all foreign providers access to domestic markets at no less favourable conditions than domestic suppliers, and would restrict government's ability to regulate, purchase and provide services. That's what it's all about. And that would change the regulation of public and privatised or commercialised services from serving the public interest to serving the profit interests of private foreign corporations. And that sounds familiar to me. It's like TTIP. So they're trying to weaken national controls, they're trying to weaken regulation, they're even trying to reverse some of the paltry measures that were brought in after the financial crash in the EU. They're even trying to reverse those. It's absolutely unbelievable. There's a list there, but I'll just come down to the last one. This is a list of what they're covering. New rules on domestic regulation to ensure regulatory settings don't operate as a barrier to trade and services. That's it. So the governments can't regulate under this if it's going to upset the trade and services. So I said TTIP, TISA and CETA are equally insidious and should be scrapped. This is Mr. O'Sullivan. And he tries to give the impression that all of this is silly stuff. And it's very difficult and it's utterly boring and you shouldn't be bothering yourself with it at all. And he said this in Dublin last week actually. Boring is used many times. The Irish Times have printed this a few times just to make sure it gets home to readers of the Irish Times. In the words of the Commission, TTIP is likely to bring prolonged and substantial dislocation of EU workers. There wasn't about time all the unions got involved in this thing. That's from the Commission. So far there are a few unions. My own, the TWEU, has done a few bits and pieces. We're trying to encourage other trade unions to join us in opposition, and we called for a scrapping. We've done things like banner drops, pickets on the EU House or whatever it is for the Parliament, and the Commission has its offices. And we've been joined by unions like the CWU, OPATSI and a few others, which is good, as there is a beginning of a coalition there. There is also a trade union conference planned for October, and I'm sure you will hear about that. It'll be trade unions against TTIP. Does that sound familiar? Then there's the People's Movement. We've been holding pickets, I'm involved in that. We've been holding pickets down at European House or Europe House or whatever it's called. And on our website there's a booklet which badly needs updating now, which is called Stop TTIP, and you'll get the basic information there. Or go to our Facebook page or website and be directed. But there are other organisations involved. I've put up, I'm going to leave this up. Oh, I can't leave it up. I'll leave it up at lunchtime maybe. So the people who want to take it down can do it. With People's Movement, Anti-Austerity Alliance, Uplift, three of whom are represented here on the platform. The TTIP Information Network has managed to bring together quite a lot of people from different backgrounds to campaign against TTIP. And Ireland Against TTIP is another organisation, and we also have Artists Against TTIP. So please become active, please spread the word. There's plenty of resources out there. We need to act fast, really. So thank you very much.
You use the word conspiracy, and it does feel like a conspiracy, being constructed, but actually, unfortunately, as you've also pointed out, it's the truth, it's reality. Whoops. And I mean, the driving kind of message is that, regulations and laws, if they're bad for trade, they're considered to be bad laws, full stop. And if you think about the way in which regulations come about, they're usually as a result of political and societal and environmental health concerns, and that is effectively being scrapped. And I think it's unbelievably worrying. One of the things that Uplift, what we want to see happen over the next while, is to create TTIP-free zones around the country. Because unless we actually bring this I suppose, into people's lives and their, families, communities, taking responsibility and ownership of the fight against TTIP, it really stays as an abstract concept, something that's happening, a boring process that's happening over in Europe, that's nothing really to do with us and our daily lives. So we're thinking of ways in which to bring it home and make it as kind of maximising, I suppose, the sense of resistance and ownership against the agreement. So we're hoping that will be rolled out over the next few months, because there is a huge amount of interest in standing against TTIP, but people often feel very helpless and kind of it's hard to engage with it in an abstract way, and trying to find ways and hooks for people to be able to take concrete action, whether that's through the whole anti-austerity process, or against water charges, or protecting public services, or whatever, protecting the environment, fracking. That there are many different ways in which people can actually become active in the fight against TTIP. Our last speaker before we have if the discussion goes to the floor is Joe Jameson. Joe has been involved in American trade union kind of activities for a long time, and also has a lot of interest and involvement in Irish political discussions as well, and has been an active member of the Irish Labour Coalition. So Joe's going to give us an American perspective on TTIP.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me to the Grieve School. I've been to 3 Grieve schools now, 2 years ago and then way back in 2004. And it's good to be in Ireland. It's good to be outside of the USA, which is a madhouse these days, even more of a madhouse than usually. My comments will be a US perspective, no PowerPoint, and I certainly share the views of the previous 2 speakers that TTIP is an enemy of Irish self-determination. It's an enemy of democracy in Ireland, and it's an enemy of democracy in the US, although we don't have the national question the way people in Ireland do. My country is the country that gives other people a national question. We don't have one like Ireland's. It looks to me, to put it succinctly, as a friendly outside observer, that Ireland already has one straitjacket in the form of the European Union, and then it has another straitjacket in the form of the euro currency, and has another straitjacket in the form of the Partnership for Peace, and now it's being asked to wear a 4th straitjacket, which would extinguish independence of Ireland. But TTIP is a threat to US democracy, at least our internal democracy, and the alignment of forces is very clear. Corporate America on the one side, so to speak, and the trade unions, outfits like Citizen Trade Watch, consumer organizations of all kinds, environmental organizations of all kinds, civil liberties organizations, because it's so obviously a deregulation agenda primarily, and the neoliberal project in the USA is primarily about deregulation, much more so than privatization. So I'm just going to give you a couple of general impressions about the underlying politics, and both Frank and Paul have done a great job of giving you the details. As I said, it's a madhouse in the USA right now. We have our never-ending presidential campaign underway at full blast, and since early 2015, the corporate media has been treating us to the antics of Donald Trump, who is very much, and I know you know about this in general, he's very much a Silvio Berlusconi figure, kind of a rich, semi-mad right-winger. There's a nastier element to Donald Trump. There's much more of a racist and a nativist and a misogynist element to him. He's impervious to criticism, and the corporate media are fascinated by him, which only in turn gets their ratings and revenues up, and gets his approval ratings up. And he's planning to, if elected, deport 11 million undocumented workers, most of them Mexican, build a wall along the Rio Grande River, a wall along the Canadian border, believe it or not. And so, and his influence is such that the 17 other Republican candidates have essentially gravitated toward his position with only a few exceptions. So that is the state of political discourse in my country. Democracy is in a bad, despite the never-ending U.S. State Department propaganda about the U.S. as the model of democratic liberties, democracy is in profoundly bad shape in the United States. And even in connection with the so-called trade treaty, you had Obama working with the right wing of the Republican Party in Congress to get through fast-track legislation, by which essentially Congress ignores its constitutional responsibilities to study legislation before it is passed. So essentially the corporations hand to the leaders of the Senate and the House the treaty. There is fast-track legislation means there is no extended discussion. The White House signs it and it becomes law, becomes a treaty. So almost a process of internal subversion or self-subversion, if that's a word. And then there's a much more fundamental turn away from democracy. It's been a long-term trend, but the downward slope is steeper now, because we have this Supreme Court case in 2010 called Citizens United. Now, big money has dominated U.S. National politics forever, but now it's completely unleashed, and massive sums of money are being secretly given to especially Republican, but also Democratic national candidates. The Koch brothers, who are the most reactionary sector of capital in the US, they're behind almost every right-wing thing that's going on in the country. They're oil and armaments and so forth. The sector that you would expect to be the most reactionary sector. They have told Scott Walker, the Wisconsin governor who smashed the public sector trade unions in his home state, that he's got $400 million to play with. And he's not doing so well, interestingly, because Donald Trump is sucking all the oxygen out of the political discussion. But we had recently, and I'll stop my survey of politics in a minute. We recently had a Republican debate, and 17 of these lunatics were all up on stage. And every single one of them was an oligarch or sponsored by an oligarch. And so it tells you a lot about the underlying class dynamics. Another feature is that not only is this enormous amounts of big money going into elections, subverting what remains of our election process, but it's dark money. We don't know. The transparency has gone down the tubes. If it weren't for heroic people like Edward Snowden and Julian Assange and others, we wouldn't know anything about the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which is the one that's the focus of discussion right now. So we've had to tease out of WikiLeaks documents what little we know. So bad is the secrecy. So let me just say that right now, very little discussion about TPIP is going on, TTIP. There's a story behind that, by the way. Those are terrible initials that easy to get confused between TPP and TTIP, and that's conscious, by the way. Originally, when this was unveiled in early 2016 by the Obama administration, it was called TAFTA, the Transatlantic Free Trade Agreement. But because NAFTA has such a lousy reputation among ordinary people in the United States, they didn't want the association of NAFTA and TAFTA, so they gave it another acronym that is confusing and mysterious and inscrutable. And TTIP sounds like Q-tip, or one of those things you use with your ears. It sounds very innocuous, but that's part of the corporate branding thinking behind this. I want to talk about a moment about NAFTA, and because it's the prism through which average people in the United States think about these issues. Whenever I come to Ireland, there's always, especially here, there's a very sophisticated discussion about the European Union, and a very impressive discussion. I admire how the analysis of the anti-democratic nature of the European Union. But we operate on a somewhat simpler level. But when NAFTA was pushed through by Bill Clinton, bribing elements of his own party who were some of them were inclined to resist. When that happened in 1994, there were consequences. About 700,000 jobs moved out of the United States, mostly to Mexico. So good-paying, unionized jobs in Pennsylvania and Ohio and Michigan moved to either the border areas of Mexico, the so-called maquiladora plants, which are where Mexican workers are paid lousy wages and their environmental conditions are dangerous. So that was the benefit in terms of the direct impact on the U.S. working class. NAFTA, in another sense, also provided a template. It gave employers in collective bargaining the power to blackmail the union. In other words, either you agree to our cuts in healthcare benefits and our unwillingness to give wages, or the two-tier system we insist on imposing, either you do that, or we're out of here. And that is an enormous factor. You wouldn't see it in the newspapers, but anybody who's inside the labor movement looking at the day-to-day confrontation with capital, it's a very powerful negative thing. In terms of Mexico, it wiped out millions of Mexican small farmers. The reason that Mexico City is metastasizing as a urban unit, it's got, I think, close to 30 million people now and still growing fast, is that small farmers in Mexico were wiped out by U.S. agribusiness, which undercut them in terms of production of ordinary commodities and staple goods. And so this is a connection between the migration crisis here in the migration crisis in the U.S. and trade treaties, so-called. There's a direct connection. The desire of millions of people, desperate people, to escape across the Rio Grande north of the border to get a job has to do with the fact that their livings were wiped out by these trade treaties. And then it also gave, finally, NAFTA was kind of a template for all of the subsequent trade treaties. The use of these ISDS, right? These investor-state dispute settlement mechanisms were built into NAFTA, and they're expanded in the later trade treaties. So let me just talk a bit about why did this TTIP originate in the USA, because I think that hasn't been emphasized enough. I think the discussion has been implicitly that these are two big blocks, and they're on a basis of equality. They are designing this new agreement. I don't think that's the case. I think there are many advantages to the U.S. arising out of this. It's true the U.S. negotiators are trying to induce or seduce elements of corporate Europe, but there is an agenda underneath the trade agreement, and I think it needs to be more clearly understood, and that is the Obama administration, when it came in 2008, it's essentially inherited 6 or 7 wars in the Middle East at various levels of violence. And the Obama so-called national security team did an analysis. They do this fairly frequently. 5 minutes, went on longer than I thought. They do a threat analysis, and their analysis was that the rising power is China, and Bush's oil wars in the Middle East were not where the U.S. should spend its blood and treasure. And so there has been an effort to extract the U.S. It's an unsuccessful effort, a bungling, clumsy effort to get out of the Middle Eastern wars and to focus U.S. economic, military, political pressure on a rising China. And that's called the pivot toward Asia. So the Obama administration they won't say this publicly for fear of Republican attack, but they have a fairly realistic sense of U.S. relative decline. There is a shifting balance of forces. As Tony said to me, the U.S. imperial moment has passed. Now, you run a risk in predicting that because there have been people in the 70s, 80s, and 90s who predicted the relative decline was setting in, but it really is setting in now. And you can see it in the inability to win any of these Middle Eastern wars. You can see it in the sense that the $600 billion military budget, the 1,000 military bases, is becoming insupportable. And so they are undertaking pressure on China, and that has taken a number of forms. They put a new military base in Australia. The U.S. is encouraging Abe with his revival of militarism. The U.S. is trying to consolidate a relationship with the new right-wing government in India. They're trying to put a ring around China. The U.S. is meddling, though it doesn't make the newspapers, or probably not over here anyway, the meddling in this island dispute in the South China Sea, trying to get Vietnam and China at odds, and all these things. The Obama administration, U.S. imperialism, is trying to manage its decline. And these trade treaties, to get to my point, are a way of locking in existing privileged positions. And it is true that the public sector is still relatively larger in Europe. Europe has more to lose. European people have more to lose if the TTIP goes through. The reason why in the U.S. The Trans-Pacific Agreement is under discussion is also part of this pivot toward Asia. There's a certain sequencing going on. When we'll get to the Atlantic Treaty within a year or two, but the focus now is on the Pacific. And it's got to do with the declining U.S. power and measures taken to prevent the consequences of that decline. My conclusion is that we ought to learn the lessons of NAFTA. The ETUC and the U.S. Trade Union Center, the AFL-CIO, has done a joint agreement on this where they essentially outline labor rights provisions that could make it acceptable. That's a big mistake. That means you didn't learn from NAFTA, in my opinion. It means that you're trying to modify essentially a rotten deal that's out to cut your throat. You can't humanize this, you just have to beat it back. And therefore I applaud the fact that the people in Ireland who are taking that approach. Another thing is to see what we can, I guess it's a strategy of weakness. The corporate lobbies, as several people pointed out, are not united, and possibly we can take advantage of rifts within the corporate sector. But we have to fight this monstrosity, root and branch. We can't humanize it. We can't attach labor rights provisions or any other provisions. We just have to kill it. Thank you.
We'll have a conversation now for an interaction with yourselves for the next half an hour. What I'm going to do is take one or two comments from the floor and allow the panel to respond. And I ask people to keep them fairly succinct so we can get as much in as possible. It's a very, very complex topic we're trying to engage with here. So I see one hand up already. Oh, I see, jeez.